Do what you want to do, work when you want to work. You're your own boss, doing it your own way. It's the last frontier way out here where dreamers and good old drifters go. Got a bit of red dirt with my claim on it, an opal down there with my name on it. A little bit of black with a flame on it I see. It's a pipe dream, but it's the right dream for me. Do what you want to do, sleep when you want to sleep. You're your own boss, doing it your own way. Yeah, and you'll get lost. Tie a ribbon around a butterwood tree. 100 dusty tracks all look the same. Chapter 21, Where Dreamers and Good Old Drifters Go. I can't believe some of the silly risks I've taken in my career. I must have thought I was bulletproof when I decided to hire a DC-3 aircraft and fly up to the Gulf of Carpentaria for 2 shows. To add to the expense, I took a band, bass, drums, fiddle and guitar. Who did I think I was, Elvis? However, in the 80s, I was on a roll and I knew there would be a song in it, and that can always make a trip worthwhile. So from Brisbane, we boarded Papa Whiskey November, the aircraft's call sign PWN, and headed towards Cooktown. Apparently PWN had been used for mapping and reconnaissance during the Second World War. Its war history was printed and framed inside the cabin. I knew that we were in for an adventure when we were greeted by Sheila, the air hostess, who was decked out in a 1940s uniform in keeping with the era of the DC-3 plane. The interior of the plane had not changed much since the war. It had a window that bubbled outwards for mapping, so you could see the ground. The view below us was wonderful, as DC-3s are allowed to fly lower than the larger planes. Our first stop was Cooktown, just over 2,000 kilometres north of Brisbane, where we stayed overnight. Hot water flowed out of the cold tap in the shower at the hotel. I was stunned. It was only September. That night I was also aware of something going on between Sheila and Bill, the pilot, in the hotel corridor. The next day we flew to Weipa for our first show in the beer garden at the local golf club. We drew a crowd of about 200 people. During the performances we were rudely interrupted by hundreds of flying foxes in the nearby mango tree, screeching and pooing as they flew over the audience. I was fascinated by the obvious romance between Sheila and Bill, who were trying not to show that they were in love. Bill was still married at the time, so they were being a bit coy about it all. Now they live on some island in the Pacific. I hear from them now and then. They're so happy. What a great love story. From Weipa, we flew to Nullumbai, the main mining town on the Gove Peninsula on the west coast of the Gulf of Carpentaria. I took a huge punt and put on a show at their showground. We went to the trouble of tying hessian around the area to avoid giving the locals a free show. It didn't help. There were still more people watching from their houses on stilts than we lured inside the hessian. I was given a necklace by a local Indigenous woman made from giddy beans stuck into balls of Spinifex wax. She told me they used the giddy beans to poison their husbands. That left quite an impression on me. The trip was certainly memorable and I hadn't visited that part of the country before. The flight back to Brisbane was spectacular, especially as we flew very low over the beautiful Daintree forest. As a bonus, the trip gave me another song for Waratah Street, Papa Whiskey November. The song is Dick Smith's favourite because he's a pilot. Whenever he comes to my concerts, I just have to sing it. Apart from Mulga to Mangoes, 1994, most of the albums released between 91's Waratah Street and 98's Pipe Dream were either repackaged compilations of previous songs, such as Love is a Good Woman, an album of love songs, or retitled older albums. During this period, I took the band to England and did the regular touring around Australia. This took up most of my songwriting time. Mulga to Mangoes picked up a number of awards, including a Golden Guitar for Best-Selling Album in 1995, an APRA Award for the Most Performed Country Work, and a Golden Guitar for Video of the Year for Tropical Fever. The very talented Mark Jago produced that video clip. Over the years, Mark has become a great mate. I value his and his wife Caroline's friendship enormously. They have produced many videos for me over the years. The time had come to head out bush again. This is where my real inspiration came from. I first met Tony Dennett in 1984 when he approached me after a show at the Vicar of Wakefield Hotel. I'd virtually created this venue for myself by bringing my little stage into the lounge area. Eventually, they built a separate room with a stage. Tony was a local orchardist from the Dural area in outer Sydney. He showed me a few pages of words for a song about his old mate who was a flower grower. The original words were very long, so I tightened them up and it was a beauty. It became Dad's Flowers. He came up with an interesting line that his old mate used. He called Parramatta Road the varicose vein of Sydney. That was the kind of line Tony was good at. In Crocodile Roll, we wrote together, "The little swine drank some wine and really pigged it out" was another one. "All Australian Boys Need a Shed" was his best. The title had so much going for it. It was easy after that to write the rest of it. So, when I was finding it a bit hard to come up with new songs for another album, I thought that Tony and I should go bush for some ideas. Tony knew a bloke who had a campsite at Grawan, a rustic little opal mining village in northwest New South Wales, about 60 kilometres from the nearest populated town of Lightning Ridge. Opal mines in Australia will always be a great source for song material. They attract characters who are extremely individual in their attitudes to life. With the exception of Coober Pedy, the rule is that you are not allowed to build a permanent accommodation on a mining lease. However, you are allowed to build accommodation out of scraps of iron and timber, a humpy in other words, much like Aborigines did as fringe dwellers in the early days. This provides an amazing atmosphere that surely was very much like the gold mining villages of the 19th century. I absolutely love the ingenuity of this bush architecture. The way rusty sheets of iron, recycled boards and local rock are used has influenced what I do around our yard at Springbrook. I'm sure the opal miners appreciate the bush as much as I do. That's part of the attraction for them. I reckon it's ironic that similar humpies were bulldozed years ago when Indigenous people built them outside town. Grawan was the perfect place to find a song or two. It was late spring, so all we had to do was stretch a cable between two trees and draw a canvas over it and sleep in the open. I was taken 15 metres underground to see what the mining was all about. You wouldn't want to be claustrophobic, as there's not a lot of room down there and the ground is quite unstable. Men have been buried alive. Opal mining hardly disturbs the trees. After a couple of years of drought, I was surprised to see how damp it was underneath the bimble box trees. No wonder these trees survived many years of the dry. In fact, that's why you can't live underground in that opal mining area. It's just too damp. It's a different story around the opal mining towns of Whitecliffs and Coober Pedy. I met Veggie Bill at Grawan. He was a wonderful old fellow who kept his life going by selling vegetables to the miners from his ute. I had a yarn to him on camera for the Seven Network's television program Bush Telegraph, for which I was one of the three presenters. I interviewed him at the club in the Scrub, a very basic timber and iron construction boasting a 9-hole golf course with barely a blade of grass to be seen. While we talked inside the club, the patrons played billiards in the background. The billiard table had a lean and the pockets were missing, so you had to fetch the balls off the floor. But we carried on while Bill talked about his life as a grader driver in the Kimberley, that northmost region of Western Australia. Opal mining meant nothing to him except for the simple life it afforded him. He just longed to go back to the Kimberley. He showed me a picture book about the Kimberley when they flooded Argyle Station to form Argyle Dam. Bill told me he talked to a frogman diver who dived under the dam and checked out the old homestead. Bill said, "The diver told me that the gates were still swinging." I was very amused at this haunting image, imagining the chooks and dogs still swimming around under the water. He also told me how he was invited to the funeral of an Indigenous family member. Apparently, they took the deceased back to their home country in the rear of a station wagon. It was a drive of several hundred kilometres, so the coffin was filled with ice. They needed to take meat for the barbecue afterwards, so they took full advantage of the situation. Yes, the sausages and steaks were stored in the coffin along with the deceased relative. Well, it was a hot day, he explained. That trip was certainly worth it. I wrote Coolabah Blue after driving through Bonville on the way to Grawin. Old Bill gave me another song, Veggie Bill, and the song Pipe Dream was also inspired by the trip. Pipe Dream really tells it as it was. It was very easy to get lost with so many tracks going in every direction and all the bushes looked the same. I have the affliction of losing my sense of direction at the best of times, but Grawin was a nightmare. Despite Pipe Dream being the highest-selling album for the year at the Country Music Awards, it failed to get a final nomination for any of the other categories. That was disappointing. The late Veggie Bill was right. The Kimberley is an amazing place. The limestone ridges that used to be coral reefs, the grand baobab trees, and rock formations that you see from two roads are just a glimpse of what's on offer. I've been a couple of times, but I've got to get back and spend some more time up there. It's like another country, and I believe its value as a tourist attraction in Australia is still in its infancy. There are more songs out there. By the time I was old enough to understand how big Australia is, I remember thinking about the Kimberley, where our explorer Ludwig Leichhardt disappeared. I had the impression that only blackfellas lived up there. Mum, Dad and Jeff went up there in a combi van for the opening of the Ord River project in 1963. I remember them telling me that the Aboriginal kids used to chase the vehicle out of curiosity. Mum brought me back a great didgeridoo, hand-painted with red and yellow ochre. There were vast stations up there, but not much else besides the three little towns of Broome, Derby and Kununurra. There were also missions up there, including one that went back to the Spanish arrivals, I believe. Now there is a bitumen road between Broome and Darwin. The Gibb River Road has been left in gravel, so four-wheel drivers can experience the old days. Dad only needed an air-cooled combi. At the end of a tour in the 90s, I went out from Kununurra to see the Argyle Dam. Its construction has really opened up the Kimberley region. Someone had told me to catch up with Roy Walker, an old ringer who had camped on the spillway off the dam. His camp was as rough as you'd expect from an old ringer, but he was always pleased to see visitors, especially me as it turned out, because he was a bush poet himself. He was eager to show me a small rock enclosure where he liked to recite his poems to visitors. One was a very romantic poem about rounding up the Milky Way when he died. Roy had a great passion for horses. He'd not long been married to a Swedish backpacker. She was a delight and obviously loved Roy. The local authorities had no problem with him squatting out there, thinking that he would be the last resident. I sang a couple of songs for them. I also put my freshly cut didgeridoo in his water trough so that it would be seasoned without cracking. I was quite sure I'd be back. The real bonus for me that his old ringer mate, Alan, was staying with him. Alan was the toughest old bloke I've ever met. He reminded me of my dad's father, Lou, square chin and wide fist, and to add to the demeanour, he had an American pit bull terrier. After listening intently to both old ringers, I couldn't believe my luck. What a story. Or two stories, really. Roy told me he was an orphan from Perth and took off as a teenager to become a ringer on Argyle Station. He told us that the only girls he met up there were Indigenous apart from the station owner's wife. I can understand how a young bloke would soon befriend the local girls. Unfortunately for the young blokes, it was deemed illegal back then to mix with Aboriginal women. Of course, it didn't stop them, and Roy told the story of being chained to a baobab tree by the local constabulary as punishment. You'd think the only policeman in the area would have more to do. Apparently, the best-looking local girls were called studs and were often employed by the station as housekeepers. These were the girls sought after by the station hands and ringers for company. Alan's story was even more interesting. Apart from working on Argyle Downs, the cattle station, he said he was a troubleshooter for the mining companies. He was employed to sort out unionists who were troublemakers. He didn't mind bragging about how good he was at his job. He also said he was the quickest ringer to kill a stray bullock on the side of the road and whack it in the freezer. Alan's most fascinating story was that he married a stud. He reckoned he was responsible for getting the law forbidding such marriages changed in Perth. The Prettiest Girl in the Kimberley came out of these two men's combined stories and is one of the best songs on the Pipe Dream album. I regularly get requests to sing that one. I'd been telling this story on the ABC radio in Darwin some time after I'd left the Kimberley, when one of Alan's sons rang the station and said he hated his father. He said that Alan was always making out that he was like Wild Bill Hickok, but he had a dark side. Apparently, the police were after Alan at the time we met. He was under suspicion of something involving his own daughter. No wonder he was visiting his old mate Roy. The police would never have found him out there. My mental picture of old tough Alan and his pit bull terrier is a bit different now. My song is not specifically about him, but more about our attitudes 80 years ago.